In this lesson, we will learn how to use CSS to position elements so that they overlap one another. To achieve this, we will use a property that you have not seen in the course yet. Its name is position. And in this lesson, we will be learning about position relative and position absolute. Our goal for this lesson is to recreate what you see in front of you now. So we can see that there's an image and then there's a caption layered on top of the image. So we can see that the description box has a semi-transparent black background and it is overlapping the bottom part of the image. In this lesson, we will learn all of the code necessary to recreate this from scratch. So I'm going to hop back over to this tab. This page should look familiar, and we're going to rewrite the code together in order to create this overlapping effect. Let's get started. Here we are in the text editor, and the first thing that I'm going to do is simply add the image to the page. Image element, source. We'll point the browser towards the file. Okay, so here's the image. We can see right away that the image is too wide for this main column. So what we can do is write a bit of CSS that targets all images on the page and gives them a maximum width of 100%, and then we'll be sure to set the height to auto. So with that in place, the image will automatically shrink to fit the main column. Next, let's add the paragraph of text that we want to overlap the image. I'll create a new paragraph, and I'll simply paste in a bit of text so you don't have to watch me type this out. So if we refresh in the browser, we can see here's the text. Next, let's add a few extra classes and elements in our HTML so that we have more hooks to target in our CSS code. So I want to wrap both the image and the text inside a parent div, and we'll give that div a class of image banner. And then the text itself, I think that should also be in a div. So we'll give this div a class of banner description. Okay, so now our HTML has these two additional hooks to target. Let's begin writing our CSS. We'll create a comment to stay organized. Banner overlay. So the first thing that we want to target is the div with the text, and it has a class of banner description. Banner description. I'm going to use a property that you have not seen until now, position, and I'm going to give it a value of absolute. Let's create another declaration with a property of bottom, and we'll give it a value of 0. Also create a declaration with a property of left and give it a value of 0. So if I save and refresh, pay attention to where this paragraph moves to. So we can see that the position that this text is in now seems completely random, but it's not. If I scroll up to the very top of the page, we can see that this text has positioned itself in the very bottom left corner of the screen. Now if I change this from bottom 0 to top 0, we can see that the text moves up to the very top of the screen. Now if we wanted the text to sit 50 pixels from the very top, we can simply change this from top 0 to top 50 pixels. And if we wanted it to sit from the left 50 pixels, we can change this to left 50 pixels. So we can see that position absolute lets us provide x and y coordinates, or horizontal and vertical coordinates, to position the element in a very particular fashion. However, by doing this, it also removes the content from the regular flow of the page. This means that as far as every other element on the page is concerned, this content no longer exists. So very quickly, let's remove this code just to prove a point. So we saw that by default, this text sat underneath the image. Now as soon as it's positioned absolutely, watch how this text, as soon as I refresh, watch this text simply move up, as if that text no longer exists at all. Now you may be wondering, why would I ever use position absolute if it completely removes the content from the flow of the page? How is that ever useful? The answer is that 9 times out of 10, in order for position absolute to be useful, it needs to be used in conjunction with position relative. So for example, when we specified that this text should sit 50 pixels from the top and 50 pixels from the left, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, 50 pixels from the left of what? Or 50 pixels from the top of what? Now by default, the browser will use the web browser window as our frame of reference for these top and left values. However, an element that uses position absolute will search up its family tree or up its Russian stacking doll model for the closest ancestor element that uses position relative. And once it finds that element, it will use it as its frame of reference for these values. So we know that in our HTML, this banner description element, which is what is housing this text, we know that it has a parent element of image banner. So if I change image banner to use position relative, watch what happens when we refresh. This text is now positioning itself 50 pixels from the top of the image banner and 50 pixels from the left of the image banner. Very quickly, let's review the HTML structure that makes this possible. This is the element that's being positioned absolutely. It searches up its family tree to find the nearest ancestor with position relative, which happens to be image banner. So it then tries to position itself in relation to image banner. So you'll remember that we wanted our description to sit at the bottom of the image. So now it's as simple as changing this to bottom 0 and left 0. So now the text will sit in the bottom left corner of the image. Now that our description text is positioned correctly, let's focus on styling it. So you will remember that we wanted a semi-transparent black background and we wanted the text to be white. So let's go ahead and give the text a color of white, and let's begin by making the background black. So this is simple enough, but we wanted a semi-transparent black background. Now up until this point in the course, all of the colors that you've seen have been hexadecimal color codes, which means typically 6 characters, and that is preceded by the pound sign. However, in order to get a semi-transparent color, we're going to use something named RGBA colors. So the letters here stand for red, green, blue, and alpha. Alpha in this context refers to alpha transparency. Now in the world of color theory, we know that we can create any color by combining different amounts of red, green, and blue. So let's imagine that we wanted this text to have a completely not transparent red background. RGBA accepts 4 values. The first is obviously R for red. Now we can enter anywhere between 0 and 255 to decide how much red we want to mix into the color. So we want it to be completely red. 255 is the highest value. We don't want any green, we don't want any blue, and A for alpha transparency, we don't want it to be transparent at all, so we enter 1. 0 is completely transparent or invisible. So this creates pure red. Now if we wanted halfway transparent red, we would change the A or alpha value to 0.5. And if we decided that's a bit too transparent, we can simply bump this value up to perhaps 0.65. So we can see the red's a bit darker now, and it's a bit harder to see through. However, we didn't want red. We wanted a semi-transparent black background. So to create black, you simply don't mix in any color. So we've zeroed out red, green, and blue. And we can see we now have a semi-transparent black background. Our styling work is almost complete. Now let's add a bit of padding around the text. So within this same banner description rule, we'll add padding. Let's give it 15 pixels vertically and 25 pixels horizontally. That looks a lot better. Now there's one minor thing that I want to fix. If we look very closely, we can see that the bottom of our text box is not lining up perfectly with the bottom of the image. Our text box is about 2 or 3 pixels too low. The reason this is happening is because the overall height of our image banner parent element is being determined obviously by the size of the image. And by default, images are inline elements. So this means when the browser tries to calculate their height, it can use things like font size and line height values, and it's not as precise. So we really want this image to be a block level element. So in our CSS, I'm going to target any image elements that live within image banner, and then I will simply tell them to be block level. So if we refresh, we can see that the two elements are now perfectly aligned. This means our goal for the lesson is complete. We've styled the elements. However, before I end the lesson, there's a few more notes on position relative that I want to share with you. We learned that with elements that use position absolute, we can provide horizontal and vertical offsets to position the element. Now we can do the same thing with elements that use position relative. So if we say top 10 pixels, left 10 pixels on our image banner container element, we can see that it moves down into the left 10 pixels. So if an element uses position relative, its frame of reference is itself. Or in other words, this line of code is saying position the element 10 pixels from the top of where it would normally sit. And this can be incredibly useful because it allows us to manipulate the position of an element without removing it from the natural flow of the page. So for example, let's remove these so the image box sits where it normally would. And let's say we want to push the image to the left by 40 pixels. We can simply say left negative 40 pixels. And there you have it. Notice that it did not take the element out of the flow of the page. This paragraph that sits below it is still acknowledging and respecting the space that this element takes up. However, even though the other elements on the page are aware of this content, they are not aware of its offsets. So for example, if we give this element a top offset of 60 pixels, you can see that it is now overlapping this text. So this paragraph of text does not know to move down 60 pixels to accommodate the offset of our image box. So let's go ahead and remove these two offsets so the image box sits where it normally would. So we've learned that you can use offsets on position relative elements when you don't want to rock the boat, when you don't want to affect literally any other element on the page. Now there is one final topic related to position relative that I want to discuss before closing out the video, and that is the battle of the overlaps. So for example, if elements have been positioned in a way that they are overlapping each other, how do we decide which element sits on top of the other? Or in other words, which element is visible? So very quickly, let's experiment. Let's push our image box to the left by 100 pixels. So we can see that it now overlaps the sidebar. Now the image box is on top of the sidebar because it's using position relative. However, if the sidebar was also using position relative, we will see that it's now on top because it comes later in the HTML. Here's our image box. If we scroll down, here's the sidebar. So the rule of thumb is, if both elements are using position relative or position absolute, whichever element comes later in your HTML will be layered on top. Now there is a way to override that behavior. So even though sidebar comes last in the HTML, if we wanted our image box to overlap the sidebar, we can use a property named zIndex. So on the image banner element, I will add a property named zIndex, and I will give it a value of 10. We can see that this places the image box on top. zIndex is essentially the stacking order of an element. Whichever element has the larger zIndex value will be placed on top of the other element. So if we went to our sidebar and gave it a zIndex of 11, it would stack on top. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. There was a lot of material in this lesson, so here's a quick review. Position absolute lets you remove an element from the natural flow of the page and instead position it in relation to an ancestor element. Absolutely positioned elements will look for the closest ancestor element that uses position relative, and it will use that element as its frame of reference. If the absolutely positioned element does not have any ancestors which use position relative, it will use the web browser window as a whole as its frame of reference. If multiple elements are overlapping each other and you want to have fine-grained control over which element stacks on top of the other, you can use the z-index property to establish a stacking order. I will see you in the next lesson.